Opposing Gloves here, and today we're going to talk about digital versus analog. Now, to start off, let's talk about what digital is. Digital is when you take a piece of audio and you represent it as numbers. It actually starts out as an analog signal. So I speak into my mic and it becomes an analog signal, and that analog signal is changes in voltage. So it comes into my microphone and gets sampled. So there's a coil in here that moves, and as it moves, it varies a magnetic field, which creates a voltage fluctuation in the wire. And this changing voltage is continuous, which is one of the big arguments for analog systems. It's a continuous signal. This is okay, but it also doesn't matter because our ears are band limited anyways. We can only realistically hear from 20 to 20K, and most people can't even hear that. Most people hear from like 50 to like 18K, and if you get old enough, or the older folks, some of them only hear up to like 10. So they're really in bad cases. So, what's the deal? What's the deal with this? Why choose one over the other then if digital is so capable? Well, what is digital? Digital is when you take that analog signal. So it ironically starts off as an analog signal, and then you sample it. So you take a whole bunch of recordings of its amplitude, the magnitude of the voltage fluctuation, and then you can recreate your signal using that. And if you are unfamiliar with digital systems on a whole, because it can be pretty misleading. Some people think that when you take a whole bunch of samples, it's like putting a piece of puzzle back together, and it's not. That's like a really bad way to think about it. So go check out my digital basics series. Digital audio basics, you don't know about that. So what are the big pros and cons between these? Well, pros for digital. Digital is substantially cheaper. Digital can perfectly recreate the audible spectrum. So the spectrum that we're concerned about, it can perfectly do that. And it also gives you unprecedented ability to manipulate the audio using plugins like you're using a DAW probably right now, and that is completely digital. You could not do that with an analog thing. Now, those are the pros, and what are the cons? Cons are it requires an analog signal to begin with, which means that the quality of it will depend on your converters. Converters are, however, cheap, and so digital is generally used. It's been implemented, especially because of its flexibility. Because now you can manipulate some things using math instead of processors and electronics that manipulate voltage. So this is a great thing. It's called linearity. So for every input, we can have an exact output, and we are guaranteed to always have that output. As long as we set our system up correctly, we can have an exceptionally linear signal where one input reduces here's an example of a system. We put 1 in, and our system will add 3 to it. So 1 plus 3, 4. If we put in like 5 plus 3, we'll get 8. Now in an analog system, this isn't always the case. It's not completely linear. Now let's go to some more cons of digital real quick. So like, for example, digital, when you reach the maximum sample rate, the bit depth which is called dB full scale, when you reach that limit and it can no longer reproduce that, you now have a problem in that you like have nowhere left to go, and you end up doing what's called clipping. And digital clipping or distorting is a horrible sounding thing because there's nowhere else in a limited system to go, and as a result, the higher frequency contents get what's called aliased back in. So the frequency content comes back, and now you have to filter that. You can't filter that jazz out because you've clipped, and you just run all these things. That's the main. So another con is the anti-aliasing, the design of filters on the conversion stages. They're called aliasing and reconstruction filters. And there's all sorts of ways of implementing it and all sorts of ways of avoiding aliasing. But essentially, we've taken the amount of information we can have, and we've squeezed it into this. We've not squeezed it in. We've just cut out everything we can't hear. It's called band limiting. Now, if we record anything for a whole bunch of other reasons that are explained in that series, in case it's all new to you, if we record anything above that, it's going to come back in and get aliased, and then we're going to have problems. And so that's a problem with digital. Now, it's not a problem if you know what you're doing and you know how to avoid it using techniques called upsampling, oversampling. There's reasons for downsampling at times. So there's all these things you can do to fix that. But anyways, so technically it gets a little involved, but digital is very popular for those reasons. Cheap and very flexible, and it can reproduce the range perfectly given you have a good converter, which is takes the analog signal and makes it into a digital signal. And also, you can perfectly reproduce that signal over an infinite series. You just recopy your binary over and over and over. Now, analog, what's the big deal about that? Analog, Used to be the only way, so it's got history behind it, which is one reason why it's very established. Now, it can be pushed because it's an infinite system. Because you got to think you can have an infinite change and variation to our voltage here as this is moving up and down and around and all doing all these crazy things. So you can have an infinite change. So when we push our stuff past, there is no dB full scale for analog. There's just clipping, which is like you push it past, it begins to distort because the signal is running through your resistors and your capacitors and all your electronic components, and it's too much for the system to handle. But instead of just, crapping out and saying we literally cannot do anything past this, it begins to add distortion. And some of that distortion is harmonic distortion. And so it actually sounds nice. Some people will say it sounds more crisp or pleasing. Another thing about analog is because the components can heat up and cool down, we suffer from non-linearity. So our performance will vary, but it will vary very minutely if you have good gear. Ironically, they're trying to make it so it doesn't vary and it is linear, but that's pretty much impossible with analog components. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's a good thing. Some people will say their boards have personality. They perform well and they're more flexible. They're kind of like having different settings. Like if you run your board if you power it up, it'll start out performing like this, and as you get going, it will perform differently. It will do all these different things, which is some people find they want that. It's a very pleasing thing to them. And because it's a continuous system, all your voltages are there. And there's a number of other things. But anyways, those tiny fluctuations, that non-linearity, because a really bad analog system is just going to sound like crap. But if you get that slight non-linearity, that was a big plus for analog gear. Now, one of the problems is it's very expensive, super expensive, and it's not very flexible. If you want to do processing, you've got to have all the gear, and every piece of gear costs more money. Shoot, even cables, you're going to go out the door just for cables. And so, generally speaking, you want some sort of mix of the two. I'm an advocate of having both because I think they're both great. Now, we do have substantially higher noise floors with analog gear, which is something that is a bummer if you don't have good gear. And every time you choose to run, so in digital land, you can run your signal through like 50 EQs and it'll be fine at the end. In analog land, your noise floor, which is again explained in the Digital Basic series, your noise floor is going to be increased every time you run it through another component. And so you've got to make decisions that are a bit different. But this also adds to the nonlinearity and some of the appeal. Like vinyl, for example, is making a comeback, and vinyl has tons of noise. People like the crackle and that kind of thing. So noise isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if your noise floor is not a good thing, that's for sure. If it gets too close to your signal, so your dynamic range will decrease substantially faster with an analog system versus a digital system. Now, it doesn't matter too much if you know what you're doing and you make your decisions correctly, but that is one of the big differences. Besides the major amount of cash you're going to spend on a board, which could be like hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, if you're doing a home studio, it might not be that much, but it's still going to be well over thousands and thousands of dollars. If you want to get compressors and reverbs, and you can't have like 10 reverbs on your stuff. So that's just a challenge you're going to face with analog. I'm trying to think of, there was one other thing I wanted to say about analog besides it's nonlinear, it's expensive, it takes up a lot of space, so you gotta have the space for it. Digital, you don't. It's not super flexible. It can do the job. So if you're a gearhead, then it's a great thing, and you've got money to spend. I highly recommend using them. I think they're great. They're not linear, so that's another thing that they're technically not perfect. And for example, tape has a limited dynamic range. It can't reproduce the full spectrum that the human ear is capable of hearing, which is another thing, which is why when they moved over to digital, it was like such a great thing. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that. Drop your opinion down below. That might not be a good invite, but go ahead and do it. Drop it down there and let me know what you think. What do you think of the two things? What points that are not covered? What points would you point out to someone who's just starting out? Of course, if you're just starting out, get a USB audio interface, go digital, get a DAW, and get a microphone, and run your microphone to it, and just start doing stuff. Just start out digital. There's no reason why anyone should start out analog these days unless you somehow miraculously have the power to do that. Because another thing about digital is you don't need to know that much. A lot of stuff has been set up in a way that you don't need to have a tremendous amount of knowledge to get going. Analog, you better freaking know where your power is, where you're plugging stuff in, how you're plugging stuff in. It's just much less forgiving. That's another thing. You need to be trained up a bit on just basic stuff. Like, it's really easy stuff, and people who know what they're doing might consider this like, but when I saw my first, I'm not sure how you felt when you saw your first mixer board, but you certainly want to be informed about making choices that are that expensive. So if you can get experience with it, I recommend it. But again, I recommend a hybrid workflow, and you just find out what you want to do and you just build as you go. So that's that. If you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe and have a blessed day.
Opposing gloves. Reversing.